welcome to CNBC Africa Exchange alongside WEF Africa. I'm Nozi Pombanjwa, and welcome to a conversation focusing on the first 100 days of Ramaphosa. Now, we know that this week marks 100 days since the official inauguration of President Cyril Ramaphosa. And of course, the big question is, has he delivered on his election promise? Globally, we know that recently at the G7, he spoke about Africa being the new frontier for development. And of course, this was in a bid to trigger and attract more foreign direct investment into South Africa to also assist the sluggish economy. Closer to home, perhaps his biggest test has come in the form of this week with a huge spike in xenophobic attacks as well as gender-based violence in South Africa. What's clear is that the president in his first 100 days has been multitasking on juggling, of course, multiple audiences, both global, continental, as well as local. To give us their insights on how they think the president has done, I'd like to invite my guest. That's Daniel Silk, sitting closest to me. He's a global political economy analyst, a common and a favorite face on CNBC Africa. Welcome, Daniel. And sitting next to Daniel is Anne Bernstein. She's an executive director at the Center for Development and Enterprise, or CDE, as it's most commonly known. Anne, thank you for joining us. We look forward to some of your insights. And last but not least is Professor Hurwan Borat. He's a director at DPRU, which is the Development of Policy Research Unit at UCT, where he's also a professor of economics. Thank you very much for making the time to join us. And I guess the first question to all of you is your assessment and analysis of how you would describe the first 100 days. Daniel, I'll start off with you.
Well, I don't think it's just the first 100 days. Of course, the president was effectively in charge for the last year or 18 months, and I think we need to look at it holistically over that period. But he won the mandate 100 days ago. And on that basis, I think that it's been a very tough and sluggish first 100 days. And the problem really for President Ramaphosa is the old issue of gaining adequate control over his own political party.
Yeah.
I think that there could have been a much greater degree of leadership, a much greater degree of impetus and urgency if the ANC as a political party itself was a cohesive unit, not divided over personality, over graft and corruption, or over ideology for that matter. And those three areas of division within the ANC, I think, are putting the brake on perhaps more dramatic initiatives from President Ramaphosa, not to mention the president's own difficulties relating to the scandal relating to his funding and issues relating to his own personal credibility. And I think it's largely it's not unraveled, but I think it's come unstuck over the last 100 days, and it simply hasn't left the president in a strong position, and he should have been in a strong position, given that in the first 100 days, this is the time when you should be moving.
Yeah.
But he has moved, and there has been change over the last 18 months in South Africa, and I think one needs to focus much broadly beyond this recent period, where I do think there are initiatives cleaning up the state of enterprises, looking at greater institutional integrity. I do think that process has begun, but it certainly has become mired in these internal elements within his own party.
So a number of issues that you raised there, the ANC potentially being a handbrake on how his leadership has come across in the country, and I'd love your comment on that, Daniel, before I move on. And also, it appears as if he might not necessarily be winning all the battles that are taking place inside the ANC. We've seen some restraint and constraint because the power play hasn't always been in his favor. Take us into the ANC tensions and the kind of impact that's had in these last 100 days, or 18 months, if you will.
Look, there are two aspects to the tensions. The one aspect certainly in my mind is the personality clashes, the factionalism, which relates also back to the years of graft and corruption and the investigations into those who have been allegedly implicated in malfeasance over the last number of years or so. And how does the president deal with that? If he hasn't got effectively via the National Prosecuting Authority the necessary guts or determination to continue with some high-level prosecutions, he really creates an inertia within his own party. And I think that's the one side of the equation. The other side, to me, is how does the ANC as an alliance of different ideological interest groups, strands, how does that complexity of the alliance address these core economic bottlenecks in South Africa? Issues relating to the role of the private sector, issues relating to just how does the state interact with business and the private sector in taking South Africa forward? There's an ideological divide within the ANC as well as a factional divide. And those are the issues that really, I think, bind the president's hands, at least for the moment.
Daniel, some really interesting ideas, and I'd love to come back to the ideology conversation if time permits. And I'd love to come to you knowing that, of course, that the CDE has done extensive research and articulated its position on how it thinks that the president has done in the first 100 days. If you could just share some of those high-level points and what your sense is of this period in the administration.
Well, I think I agree with Daniel. You have to look at the last 18 months or so. But if you're looking at the period since the election, I think the reality is that this is a president whose party is deeply divided and is ideologically divided and has been permeated by lots and lots of people whose only interest is to loot the state rather than to govern. This is very difficult, but I think for many people, he's lost momentum. The election was a big endorsement of the president. The ANC did lose some votes, but I think increasingly the ANC election campaign centered around him and reforming the ANC as much as reforming the country. And having got 57%, this was an ideal moment to say that I'm the president of the entire country.
Yeah.
And to take some bold moves, and that's what's been missing. So the ball has slipped on Eskom. The country's economy is increasingly precarious. Our macroeconomics are fundamentally unsound, and we're on a completely unsustainable debt trajectory. And you're starting to see, with the events of the last week, which I don't think we know all about them, and I think you should be careful to just label these xenophobia too quickly. Of course, there are attitudes about foreigners being displayed, but there's enormous criminality going on, so we have to look at the role of the police, we have to look at who's behind some of these things, and about a failed immigration policy. So there are a lot of things going on. I think the president has failed to lead in the last 100 days, and that's easy to say. He sits on the horns of a dilemma, but then leadership is about how you rise above those dilemmas and carve a way forward. So I think he started well last year when he was walking every morning or with people and listening and talking. You don't hear much about that anymore, if at all. I'm waiting for him to really take the nation into his confidence and say that we're in a very difficult situation, and that requires tough choices. It's not business as usual, and here are some of the tough choices I'm going to make. You have to start with Eskom and the country's finances, which are now so big that they're not only caused by low growth and a number of other things, but they now hold back growth. So we can't say, we're going to get growth. We're not getting growth. And we're not going to get growth until it's clear to investors and many other people that there is a firm hand on the tiller. We can barely afford what we pay for already. So we certainly can't afford anything new at the moment. And we're going to have to make the hard choices about the state-owned companies, where we not only have to look at each one of the major ones and see how are they going to cut expenditure or increase revenue. Should they be in the public sector at all? Should they exist at all? There's some big choices here, and we've got to rethink the state-owned companies, and we're going to have to go along the direction that the Minister of Finance's economic policy document, or whatever it is pointing. The president has to start to lead the nation. He's got to restore hope. He's starting to sound less credible, in my view. He's got to articulate some real wins. His strategy of last year with summits on investment, on jobs, various other things, frankly, I never believed in them, and I don't think the Jobs Summit has delivered at all. And if anybody read the report after 9 months of the Jobs Summit and a report on the 77 projects that were supposed to be embarked upon, well, quite frankly, I was shocked. And it's quite nice to know you can still be shocked in South Africa. I was shocked at how little has been achieved.
Right.
Almost nothing.
I'm going to come back to the question of initiatives and summits, because this is an administration that hasn't lacked in the ideas and the initiatives and summits, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to bring the question of the growth, the GDP number that came out yesterday, surprising positively on the upside to you, Haroon. But before I get this, and I just want to stay with you on one more question. You know, Daniel spoke about, and I love the use of language here, the complexity of the alliance that makes up the DNA of the ANC. If we say that President Ramaphosa has failed to lead, and we look at this through this complexity of the alliance and this difference in ideologies within the ANC, surely this is not new. Surely this has been the anatomy of the ANC over many, many years. So what is it about this particular administration that has failed to maneuver within that context? The ANC has really hardly ever been a homogeneous body of homogeneous ideologies from inception, really. So I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that. And I see you nodding, Daniel, so I'll ask you to weigh in as well.
So I'm saying since the election, we've seen a failure of leadership, in my view. I think South Africa can't go back to the pre-Zuma era of the ANC, where you could muddle through a bit of socialism here, a bit of capitalism there, a great world economy, and somehow we'll make a plan. This is not going to work. South Africa is much weaker today, and the truth is the ANC needs to become a political party, and it's been this enormous alliance of people who are communists all the way to people who are to the right of me. Okay, so this can't work. We have to make some choices, but it's not ideological anymore.
Yeah.
You can say you believe in a developmental state and you want the state to play a big role in South Africa's economy, and somebody else might disagree. The fact of the matter is, as government bodies and senior people keep telling us, many parts of the state have collapsed. They're either ridden with so much corruption that they're ineffective and you're scared to give them any more money, or they're full of people who are just not competent to do the job. So in that context, this is no longer an ideological conversation. It's what does South Africa have, and how do we build on that to move forward? And that's where the unresolved ideological issues in the ANC come into play. How do you grow this economy? There are different views, fundamentally different views. Within one ruling group. It's too big. You can't find a consensus.
So I mean, I'd love to get your voice in on this before we move on from this point, because again, just to reiterate why I raised this, is that spectrum has always been there. So what is it fundamentally about this administration that's failing to maneuver within that context?
So if I could just take one step back, I mean, I think it's important if we're thinking about the first 100 days or, a year on from President Ramaphosa, is that you've got to distinguish, and we have to distinguish as a society between the short run and the long run.
Right.
There's the short run battle, and as crazy as it sounds, the short run of a 10-year period of state capture. So in fact, the short run battle for the president has been to overturn the vestiges of state capture. And we've seen progress. I would argue we've seen fairly rapid progress, right, with respect to overturning and reclaiming institutions of the state, the security cluster, the intelligence cluster, and so on. We're not quite there, but that's been an important battle that he's waged and arguably is winning, if one thinks of the various commissions and so on. The longer run battle around growth, right? Let me just give you one figure. For the last 20 years, South Africa's grown at 1% per annum in real terms. Just think about that. For 20 years, annually, at 1% per annum. China grew at 12%. So the long-run features of low growth and so on are important. That means that they're inherently structural. They're embedded in the and we can debate that, but they're embedded in the nature of South Africa's growth path. This is not a 100-day job, right?
Yeah.
I think we have to be realistic. We have to be clear about the art of the possible if one is asking the direct question. Now, does that mean that you give full marks and you praise singer for the president? No. I mean, that does mean that you need to think about the longer run. If we look at the next 20 years, what is it about our path dependency in growth that needs to change? And I think the idea, you asked the question, how can we manage this wide spectrum of views within the ruling party and so on, I think is important, because the first thing that happened, and we all knew, is that when Treasury released its growth document, is that there'd be a response from the union movement, right? We've seen this movie playing over and over again in the past. That's not going to take us to 5% growth rates. So there's got to be something creative in the policy space, something different that we've got to do. We've got to unlock the way we think about growth, the way we do growth. And to be honest, I think there are solutions that can work. And one can give examples, say if you think of the national minimum wage, for example, where you can bring all parties to the table. But I do agree with Anne, the idea of summits and social plans and so on are long gone. I don't think that's going to build the kind of base we need for much higher levels of growth.
So, Daniel, I know you want to weigh in back into this conversation, so let's bring your voice in there.
I think the complexity really is that, and I'll cut the president some slack in terms of the first 100 days, and Haroon has correctly mentioned, we've seen a lost decade, and the president, in fact, alluded to that. But it's not just a lost decade, it's a lost decade of policy making within the ANC. So what we've largely seen is that the ANC, in successive party conference, policy-making conference, has made policy relating to redistribution, but it has barely touched policies necessary for growth in South Africa. And the 1% 20-year average, indeed, I think, proves that. So now we have to move away from the obsession, in a sense, with redistribution to an equal obsession into the future with growth-oriented policies. And the real issue is, how do you inject that into a broader ANC that has largely not considered those options for the last decade, that hasn't had the skills, that hasn't perhaps even had, in my view, the intellectual debate within the ANC to really address those issues. And really, that's where the president needs to come in. He needs to inject a degree of leadership into every policy formation of the ANC, together with business, the private sector, civil society, and all the rest of us, to bring us on board into that. Because the ANC is the governing party. We're going to have to live with the ANC unless the ANC's vote drops to below 50%. And if the president doesn't get this right, just from a political point of view, in the next 4 years until the next election, he now doesn't have a cushion of comfort of over 60% of the popular vote. Indeed, the ANC vote could drop to perilously close to 50% or less if we don't see a turnaround.
Assuming he makes it through to the 4 years. So let me get Haroon in, and then Anne, I'll come to you.
Just to embellish on the 1%, and I think it's important because it does direct us to the kind of policy we need to think about, is that if you, and we've done the numbers on this, is that if you look at the nature of gains to people across the income distribution, the ironic thing is that the bottom end of the distribution have gained. That's social grants, the minimum wage, and all sorts of protective measures from benevolent state. The top end have gained because all of us are highly skilled, highly educated, and there's a shortage of us. And so we retained through higher premiums offered on wages. There's been a problem of the missing middle. And so if you look at the middle of the income distribution in South Africa, it's collapsed. People in the middle of the distribution, of the wage distribution, have actually lost out. Whether in real terms wages have actually fallen for those people. And so the nature of our growth trajectory has actually been, let's see productivity from the top end of the economy, the highly skilled. The state then uses those resources to redistribute to the bottom end. Unions come in, not deliberately, but when they negotiate the bottom end. And in fact, companies then manage the wage bill, and that means squeezing the middle. And you see this move, you see this being played out constantly. So our problem system ultimately is a growth trajectory, right, that's not sufficiently inclusive, not of the bottom end empirically, but of the middle of the distribution. And if I could just finish with I think that's playing itself out in a lot of ways in terms of the social strife that we're seeing, in terms of the protests at a local government level that we're seeing. There's this notion that we have a growth crisis that in all ways looks much better than it actually is, because the big numbers seem fine. It's 1%, it's not minus 3%. But one worries about the structural features of this missing middle in terms of our growth trajectory.
I think Anne and I are just really excited to get in on that. And maybe, Anne, you can say something. And I've got a question about the missing middle as well. But thank you for raising some of those points. Anne, go ahead first.
So let me make a few points. The first is that Haroon's right if you're looking at the formal economy. The people who've really lost out are the people who don't have a job at all. So he's talking about the lower end as people employed. I'm really interested in the 50% and more South Africans who live in poverty, and the now over 10 million people who do not have jobs. So, and many of those are young people. We have the highest youth unemployment rate in the world, probably, and it's those people who are not part of what Haroon's talking about. That's the first thing. The second thing is, yes, it's fine to say we should look at a longer-term horizon. I would like to have a longer-term horizon, but the issues facing South Africa now, this year, next year, the short-term, whatever you mean by that, are actually going to determine our longer-term. So we're losing skills at a more rapid rate than for a long time now. People who would invest in this country, people who have the skills we need to build South Africa. We have people losing hope in the future of the country, not just at the upper end, but at the lower end. People who are getting involved in the criminality or who just can't see a way out for themselves. Because if you're aged 15 to 34, the prospects of getting a job are declining. So since the job summit, the job situation has got worse. So I think one does have to be reasonable. One has to look at the dilemmas facing the leader of the country, and I have a lot of sympathy for that. But unless he has a gear change, the country is not going to have a very prosperous longer term. And that's what concerns me. We're seeing, he's got a plan. Keep being assured. He's got a plan. And I listened to him this morning, and he can give you a longer term plan. And do you expect me to go around the country with handcuffs? No. I do expect you to put more money into the NPA than you do into SAA. Okay, that's a choice. South Africa's facing a choice of where do we allocate our resources at a time when we're not growing and tax collection is slipping. Where do you put your money? You can't have everything. So I think you do have to say, how do we change the nature of our growth? And I'm sure Haroon and I agree in many respects on we need a much more inclusive growth path. And of course that takes time. I agree with that. But in the short term, decisions really matter. And I keep being struck by what Harold Macmillan said. It's events. It's events.
So we've got about 6 minutes left of this conversation. I'm struggling to get a question in here. So I'm going to park my question. I'm going to offline it with you, Haroon, about the middle class. But what I do want to raise is that even as you speak now, and I can concede that 100 days might be quite an unfair metric to say this is the reflection of the impact of an entire administration. Fair enough. But if we were then to say, looking forward, what are the cues that the multiple audiences that he's playing to are going to be looking at to then really build the case to say this is an effective leadership? So, what would the international community be looking for locally? What does he have to get right? And I'm lifting my head now in terms of looking at the immediate horizon and saying, in the next 300 days, 500, 600 days, what are the cues that the signals he's got to send out to the international, the continental, and the domestic community as he moves forward? And I'll start with you, Haroon.
So, I think the signals, at least the global audience, if one was, I was recently at the TCAD event in Tokyo, the signals one gets about President Ramaphosa are incredibly positive, because the relative position is where South Africa has come from, which is a period of unbelievable strife in terms of state capture and institutionalized corruption. At least the audiences one mixes with watch very closely your key ministries, the economic ministries, and public enterprises in particular, and they know that these are now departments in very good and capable hands. So I think the signaling has been very, very positive. I think the conversation now is, given the signaling, what are the specifics that South Africa and South Africa's leadership can show in terms of, and I come back to this, more creative economic policy making. And I'll give you one example. We have instituted a national minimum wage, right? And the national minimum wage is a fait accompli, and it's given. Fine, 20 Rand an hour. There are real concerns, say, for example, in the furniture industry, which employs rural women, and it's an unskilled, relatively unskilled, labor-intensive industry. There are real concerns that little hub in KwaZulu-Natal will actually close down because of the national minimum wage. Now, the argument should not be about debating whether there should be a minimum wage or not. The argument should be a creative policy solution which says, well, maybe if we phase in the minimum wage for that industry on the one hand, and on the other hand, look at tariff protection. Tariff protection that protects South African furniture manufacturers from cheap Chinese imports.
Right.
Because believe me, the Chinese importers are actually being subsidized by their very own government. That's an example of just one of a creative policy solution. One can go for the big bang of, undoing the alliance or having a go at how ANC politics works. But I think creative policy solutions can shift the needle appreciably. And you can begin to see how we can change the nature of the growth trajectory fairly quickly. If you do that one change in the furniture industry, you've protected 5,000 jobs.
This has been a conversation unpacking and analyzing the first 100 days since the official inauguration of President Cyril Ramaphosa. It seems as if it's a mixed bag of assessments. Words like failed to lead have come up into this conversation, and it sounds like it's been quite a lethargic start in terms of the first 100 days of this administration. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. Remember that you can continue to be a part of this conversation. That's by following us on Twitter at CNBC Africa, using the hashtag CNBC Africa Exchange or hashtag WEFA19. That's WEFA19. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Nozi Pombanjo.